Well, good evening. I've been practicing for the last 5 days my Canadian. So just give me some feedback on that feedback sheet, okay? But really, thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you, Daniel, for your courtesy today, and it's been a wonderful day. And Gillian not only organised tonight beautifully, but she paid the absolute kindness and courtesy of inviting an old friend whom I've known over the net for a long time and only met a few years ago face to face, Tom Lacona and his wife Judy, and they're here tonight with us. So I think we should welcome Tom and Judy. Tom very kindly has driven up from Cortland in New York State to be here tonight, and he's just here overnight, and it's a very kind gesture from him. We're going to move tonight through a lot of material fairly quickly. So there is a real danger that you'll walk out of here with your head buzzing. So as we go through this, what I would love you to do is to think in terms of what goal are you going to walk out that door with? 1 or 2 goals only. One of the big messages tonight is that your job is to teach your kids to think for themselves. And we're going to be talking in detail about how in order to do that they have to manage their emotional life, etc. But one of the most important skills in thinking for yourself is to be able to set goals for yourself, because goals are quite empowering. They focus your energies and you can pursue something that's worthwhile. And if you want your kids to be able to set goals for themselves, you have to set goals for yourself. It's very important that you don't walk out of here tonight without some clear resolution, and then refine that talking with your spouse. Maybe tomorrow night over a cup of coffee, but certainly over the next couple of days, tie it down so you both agree on the goal, and then revisit that goal in a month, in 2 months, in 6 months. Because if you're able to put from tonight a resolution into practice that you're confident will help your family life and your relationship together as a couple or with your children, you watch how much good it does. And that's I think the great beauty of the family education courses is they teach us the skills. They don't just give us information. There'll be a lot of information tonight, but you need to also develop the skills. And I think the way to do that is to target a goal. Okay, I'm going to rock into this. Let's see how we go. That's the Ottawa of the Southern Hemisphere. Gee, you have a beautiful city. I walked down the canal today to the river and then walked back up via the cathedral and that upper area. But gee, it's a beautiful town. I had no idea it was such a beautiful city. Anyway, but Sydney's also beautiful, so come on down. And that's where I've spent most of my teaching, Redfield College. I was there for 25 years, 15 as the principal. We play rugby there. Then I moved for 3 years to Wallamai College, which is in the west of Sydney. It's a newer school of the Parents Foundation, the Parents for Education Foundation. And if you went to Australia for World Youth Day, that's the bishop who was in charge of World Youth Day, who is now the Archbishop of Sydney, Bishop Anthony Fisher, and he's got the school captains in a sort of scrum formation. But it's a beautiful school, which is relatively new, and the whole point of these 2 schools is to give as much support to parents as possible. Because if the playing field isn't level for parents, if there's a peer group or if there are teachers saying things which absolutely contradict your values, then it's very difficult to get enough weight on the end of the seesaw to be the decisive influence in the lives of your kids. It's a big challenge. I don't know about your society, but my society is making laws now, and the media often is saying things which are very unfriendly to families. I think it's harder now to raise children than it has been in my lifetime. And one of the messages I hope you walk out with tonight is don't be anxious, simply have a game plan. Because being anxious teaches your kids to be anxious, and that's not what you want to do. We have to stride through life, but in order to do that, we've got to very clearly know where we're going. Otherwise, we'll get sidetracked. Okay, so pick 1 or 2 goals. Look at that gentleman and his boy. Look how similar they look. That's your privilege. You're putting your stamp on your kids. Not only externally, but internally. The behaviour of your kids will be like your behaviour. But more to the point, your children will love what you love. And one of the big messages tonight will be that you teach your children what they should love if you're a diligent parent. And we will talk about how you teach your children to love what they need to love. How do you manifest your emotion to your kids? Do you simply mirror back to them the emotion that they give to you? Because if you do that, you're not going to teach them what to love. You have to lead from the front. In the words of Ross Campbell, the guy who wrote that beautiful book, How to Really Love Your Teenager, he says that it's up to parents to emotionally nourish their children, not for parents to look to their children for emotional nourishment. That's the book, and it's very much a summary of what we were doing with parents in the schools in Sydney and the messages that we wanted to keep alive, the collective wisdom about parenting. And there are quotes in it from Thomas Lacona. He taught me everything I know. Let's start with temperament and character. What's the difference? A little illustration. There's a young couple who I'm involved with in a school board in Melbourne, and they have little tiny twins who are now 3 years old. And we were on the site of a school which has just started in Melbourne. It's 15 acres in a rural environment. It's very beautiful. It's about 35 minutes from the business district. And there were hay bales, like rolled up bales of hay on this 15 acres. And we were jumping, they were together, and we were jumping from one to the other. And Dan, the guy with the twins, had one 3-year-old under each arm, and he's jumping from hay bale to hay bale. It was fairly safe. And then he said, "Here, you take Immy," and he gives me Imogen. And Immy didn't want to come with me, so he takes back Immy, and then he says, "Mia will love to go with you," and he gives me the other identical twin. And the other identical twin has no problem, and she does this sort of Titanic thing, flying through the... It was very beautiful. But what's the point? Even temperament, you have a role in forming, because they were identical twins, but they have slightly different temperaments. But temperament is all about the very, very first conditioning and the very first stable emotional responses are developing in a young person. But we're talking tonight principally about character, which are the good and bad habits that we all develop. Or the good and bad, particularly the bad habits that we're complacent about in our character. So your temperament and the temperament of your children is not destiny. We can change those habits, because remember that temperament is an emotional disposition. Some children are... when I walked downtown today, there was a sign on a lamppost saying such and such a cat, had a picture of a cat, and then it had missing, and then it had very shy, may not approach you. Even cats have temperaments. It's interesting, isn't it? So your children, what they're born with, or what they receive in their very, very first months, that's their temperament. But what makes character is the choices that we make. And your job is to teach your children how to make the right choices, and that they're not managed by their impulsive life, their emotional life. And of course our emotions fuel our lives and enrich our lives, but they can't run our lives. There's a very subtle difference. So we're moving from that's the way my child is to the way that I want this young person to be in adult life. Because you need to be the decisive influence in the life of your child. And you cannot surrender that ground to anybody else. You have to be in the game. Then you do have to make sure that your example and everything that you're doing is leaving the right impression, because a child is very impressionable. Look at this. This is a 10-month-old child about to be presented with his favourite toy. His name is Isaac. He's the son of a staff member of mine in Sydney. His favourite toy is a Canadian moose. No joke.
Sure you don't want the moosey? Okay, what about the phone? Oh, you want the phone?
That's what you're up against. Let's talk a little bit, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I want to illustrate with the next couple of slides that what you do in the very first months and years of a child's life are decisive. That child was 10 months old, and you can see already it's learned a lot about what it wants in life. We know about attachment style. We know that the way that an infant behaves when its parent or caregiver is away and returns, and if that child frets excessively, or if the child doesn't respond at all, is fairly passive in the absence of their parent and the return of their parent, those are indicators of emotional issues later in one's life. But more important than that, we know that the reason that a child behaves that way, if a child is at those polarised ends of the spectrum, or if its attachment style is more or less reasonable and normal, we know that that is a factor of whether or not the mum and the dad know how to empathise with the child. If you're good at putting yourself in your infant's booties and knowing how your child will react and think, then that's where your child learns his or her attachment style. So a parent who is not very empathetic is already conditioning their child in the wrong way. And it's an indicator of problems later on. What sort of psychology do you have? What anthropology do you have? What's your understanding of what motivates us as human beings? Oscar Wilde, as we know, had a same-sex attraction, which he pursued. He says, this is his words, he says, "I was no longer the captain of my soul, and I did not know it. I allowed pleasure to dominate me." One thing is feeling, another thing is pursuing the behaviour, obviously. And he says that he allowed pleasure, impulsive reactions to dominate his life. Isn't that interesting? So we need to make sure that we're raising children so that they are masters of their soul in some way, that they are the captain of their soul. Look where the first quote comes from. And this was on the slides before Tom Lacona appeared this afternoon. I did not know this guy was coming. And Tom Lacona is telling us good character consists of habits of knowing the good, habits of desiring the good, habits of doing the good. Habits of mind, heart and action. And where does that come from? Did he make it up? No. Aristotle wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics for his son Nicomachus. And the best gift he could give his son was to teach his son to form good habits. We just had posters a couple of years ago sent to all the schools in Australia, and they have to be displayed. It's the law in the school. And the poster says, "Values in Australian schools." There's nothing particularly offensive about the posters, but it didn't want to use the virtue word, it uses the values word. And values are not habits. Values are not good intentions. They're attitudes of mind, but they don't necessarily carry through to action. You need them, but somehow they're incomplete. So when you hit the snooze button in the morning, or when you make a list of jobs and you don't do those jobs, you have the value of doing those jobs or getting up, but you didn't have the behaviour. And we have to do our kids the favour of raising children with the whole spectrum of behaviours. How to think clearly, how to put others first, how to manage their fears, and how to manage their impulsive desires. 4 categories, and we're going to come back to this time and time again tonight. They did, on the west coast of the States, they did an academic reconstructed the surveys that were done in the 1980s, which led to a thing called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. And an academic in the 1980s did a very thorough piece of research where they recorded the types of people they were interviewing, and then they interviewed them with a standard survey that they designed, and then they came up with some sort of quantitative evaluation of how narcissistic they are. And by narcissistic, they meant very self-centred. They didn't really care much about other people at all. And then that was, they did the same survey again with a very as similar a sample as possible. Same profile of students, same university, same age, same balance and everything. I think it was in 2011 because they reported on it in 2012. And they discovered that students now, 30 years on, are more narcissistic. This is your children. This is a problem because one of the most important things you're raising your children to do is to develop loving relationships with each other, with their spouse, with God, and to be narcissistic, to be self-centered, to not be able to take others into account, completely hits at the trunk of that important aspiration for human beings. Look what Jim Stenson says is, look, children grow up when they can look after others and want to. How do you define growing up for your kids? Do you define it in terms of age? Do you define it in terms of the skills that they develop? Or do you define it in terms of how they relate to others? I think you will measure, in 30 years' time, how will you measure whether or not you've been a good parent when you look back? It's a very important question. How will you measure whether you've been a good parent? And I suggest there's two key areas. Whether you've succeeded in passing on to your children your most cherished values and faith, ideals, and secondly, whether or not your sons and daughters are capable of entering into lifelong loving relationships with their spouse, with their kids obviously, but with God as well. And if you can't tick those two boxes, you'll think, oh gee, I wish I'd done a better job. And it's never over. It's never over. Your job is still to keep supporting your kids with your prayers and your encouragement and your advice in 30 years' time. But you will wish you had been able to tick those two boxes. So we have to set those goals for ourselves now. This is a little bit of a summary of this idea of the 4 virtues that you need to develop in your kids. So the top 2 boxes on the right refer to the emotional responses that we need to condition. Remember, you can have cats that are shy. So you condition animals in terms of you can train a dog to be daring, you can train a dog to have self-control. You've probably seen the picture of the cat walking in front of the row of Alsatians, right? Into the valley of death, you know? It's amazing. But both the cat and the dogs were somehow trained not to react. You can train, just as you train dogs and cats, in a sense, very tiny children, you need to train them in their emotional management in some way. And I don't want to sort of make it too crass, but because it's an ongoing thing, even as adults, we train, you know, we tell ourselves what to do, not to eat on impulse and raid the fridge. But we do need to understand that it's very much a conditioning operation. Aristotle said that moral education is about training and education of the mind, training of the emotionals, of the emotional responses. Our desire for pleasure and our readiness to put up with difficulties for a good reason. That in both cases, we need to make choices. We need to choose that, yes, that's a pleasure that's good for me, and that's a difficulty that's worth putting up with. And your children learn to do this because of your guidance. They obey your reason when they have to do something difficult. Because Aristotle then says, if they can obey your reason when they're tiny, they can obey themselves when they're older. And then, of course, the bottom 2 boxes there are about putting others first, always measuring our actions by others. And finally, what's prudence? I like to think of 2 things constituting prudence. One is knowing what's right and wrong, and secondly, being able to set the right goals, being able to prioritise properly. If you can do both those things and you always measure your actions taking others into account, then you'll be able to chart your own course, and your kids will be able to chart their own course very well through life. So virtues, the path to fulfilment. This is not my thoughts. This is not something from the 20th century. This is timeless. For 2,500 years, moral education has focused on the development of virtues. Only in the last 60 or 70 years have we stopped talking about virtues. We need to return to it. And as John Paul II, but also Aristotle would remind us, we are fulfilled by what is true, and we are fulfilled by the capacity to love. And if we don't seek the truth, and if we don't learn to love wisely, to make wise love choices, then we've missed the boat somehow. And if we're to love, we have to know how to sacrifice ourselves, because love is all about generosity and selflessness. Remember the narcissistic survey. So if children are self-centered, they will not be able to love. One of your main jobs as a parent is to raise your kids so they're not self-centered. And that means you just have to keep at it, because kids are naturally self-centered. No child is born in this world not self-centered. So temperament does not teach a person to be other-centered. Maybe there's a tendency there to sort of, have a kind disposition, but nobody is born thinking of others. And that's your job as a parent, to teach your kids really to be centered on others. And without your example, that's not going to happen. Now, we get to the practical bit. See the number in the top right corner? Top left corner, sorry. When we get to 15, we're about to finish. At Redfield, the school I was for a long time, there was a bandmaster who was a wonderful, wonderful guy who had 12 children. He came out of the army to run the band at Redfield, and thank goodness he came out of the army, because he knew how to organise a home very well. And he was pretty strong sort of character. And he's driving home one afternoon, and his son, 10 years old, sitting next to him, says, "Dad, are you going to stop? It's Valentine's Day. Are you going to get Mum some flowers?" And he says, "I don't believe in that commercial nonsense." And then his son, who is very much a chip off the sort of forthright character of his father, says, "Dad, it's not what you like. It's what it's not what you think, it's what Mum likes." And he stops and he gets the flowers, and he has the humility next day to talk about it in the staff room. And he says, "We had a great night." So in the end, sacrifice, compromise, giving of ourselves, it's just essential. One parent said to me, "I get it now. When Sally and I are good, the kids are good." Look at the quote. The quote comes from 2,500 years ago or more, 3,000 years ago. Homer says there's nothing better in this world than that a man and woman be of one mind. And to be of one mind, you have to be communicating a lot. You need to be really on the same wavelength, talking a lot, every night talking. One friend of mine told me that when his wife was expecting their first child, he said to me, "She just wants to talk and talk at night." It's okay. I mean, it's natural, isn't it? It's almost natural. If you're going to have the same values in the core of your being, then you really have to dialogue. You have to mesh a lot. And there's so many sad stories of couples who they raise their kids and then they drift apart. True story. A friend of mine, he's a very good friend, and his wife's a very good friend, and now they're together again, thank God. But when their youngest child had just left school, she said to him, "Steve, I'm moving out. I've got to get a life." He was flabbergasted. He did not see this coming. One of the parents I've taught as a lawyer said, in his experience, men are 3 years behind what their wives are thinking. It's a worry, right? He didn't see it coming. He was blindsided totally. And it took 5 years of prayer and him changing his life totally, and really extraordinary events for them not only to get back together, but then to be on television talking about how they got their marriage back together again. And she's a wonderful lady. And the reason they were able to get back together is he from the very first moment he realised, I've contributed to this. He didn't go blaming. He said, this was my fault too. I've got to fix myself. He didn't tell her what to do. He fixed himself. But he never stopped hoping. So if you ever have friends who lose their marriages, or if you yourself are on your own and somebody's abandoned you or something, right? Don't give up hope, because that was gone for all money. She had a new boyfriend. It was gone. But he kept on hoping, kept on praying. Interesting. What's the secret of the longest marriage? If you go to the Guinness Book of Records a couple of years ago, they talked about Percy Arrowsmith and his wife. Percy Arrowsmith was 103 and his wife was 104, and they married 80 years before. And they asked Mrs. Arrowsmith, "What's your secret?" And she said, "We never go to bed without making up our differences." And then they asked Percy, and he said, "Always say yes, dear." They're great. What about responsibility? Big lesson for me very early on when I took over as principal of a school was I got a situation where a child, a long time after school was finished in the afternoon, twisted his leg wrestling, mock wrestling with another child. In the end, it wasn't a serious injury, but there was fear for a couple of days before it was scanned that it was a really serious injury. And the parent came up to the school and said, "Who was on duty? Who was the teacher responsible when this happened?" And I'm thinking, this is like half an hour at least after school finished. And then I thought to myself, no, you're right. Whenever there are children, there has to be an adult responsible. And you're responsible. Nobody else. You can't delegate that responsibility in a sense, right? If a teacher is saying or doing something in a class that you're not happy with, then it's your responsibility to do something about it. Nobody else is responsible for the moral upbringing of your child. You are. And you have to have your say. And that having your say is fortitude. In the new document I realise we come from various faiths here, but the new document the Pope has put out on the family, he's got a beautiful set of paragraphs about what to put in the courses for newly marrieds or for people who are about to be married. And he says, look, it's really important that we emphasise two virtues. Generosity, because these guys will have to live for each other, and fortitude, because they will have to overcome many difficulties in order to make their relationship and their family flourish. So we have to model the fortitude for our kids, don't we? Do you remember what John Paul II said, remembering his own father? He said he woke up in the middle of the night, he looked through into another room, they lived in a 2-room apartment, literally. He looked into the other room and his father was on his knees at 2 a.m. And he said, my father never had to be tough on me, he was so tough on himself. So, we don't teach fortitude by slapping kids or by spanking them, we teach fortitude by our example first of all. And, I've done surveys of people and saying, and I'm thinking myself too, right? But, how many times do you remember being spanked? How many times do you remember? And people who are adults and very balanced, it varies from 0 to so many times I've forgotten. It's got nothing to do with spanking kids. It's really important that we don't get into habits where we end up modelling behaviour for kids that necessarily isn't that good for them. Once a child's old enough to remember it, maybe he's too old to spank or she's too old to spank, There's no rule there, right? What about affection? This is a true story. This is beautiful. The guy who took over from me as the principal at Redfield, he told me this story, and it's in the book, but he said, because he got older boys, and the older boys had been using some fairly colourful language at one time, and the 4-year-old gets sent to his room upstairs for using the F word. So the little guy comes down after half an hour, however long it was, and he says to his mother who's preparing dinner, I don't want to live in this family anymore because I can't say, and he says the word, I can't say whenever I feel like it. And Mum just continues doing the carrots, and she says, mate, where are you going to live? And he says, it's okay, you guys are going to have to move out. And then she says, what are you going to eat? And he says, I'll take a banana from the bowl. So reasons don't work. So then she plays her ace. And her ace, who's going to give you cuddles? And then he goes all wrinkly and he says, I think I made a mistake. So you've got to be absolute experts at affection, right? The lady who launched Parenting for Character was the most well-known children's court magistrate in Australia. And she was very feisty and she told the government what they should do to care for kids who are on the streets or whatever, right? And she said, bluntly, talking to the parents of a school I was at, she said, every child who's come into my courtroom has lacked affection at home. we've got to be experts at affection, and it's not easy to show affection to a teenager who's coming back to you with emotion and negative attitude, right? But you've got to be experts at emotion. Remember, you're not there to seek emotional nourishment from your child. You have to set the weather. You have to show them how to stay calm when the people around you are not. So it's no good losing our nerve and getting anxious and upset when kids get anxious and upset. That's a lack of fortitude in the end. Or it's an ingrained habit which reflects a lack of fortitude. It's a conditioning of our emotional responses, which we have to then reset. Affection has to go with expectations. A guy called Don Edgar, who was the director of the Australian Institute of the Family, I went to a lecture he gave once and he said, all good parenting comes back to one graph. I think, wow, everyone's ears pricked up, you know. And he said, on one axis is affection, on one axis, on the other axis, is clear boundaries, clear expectations. And you have to be high on both. If you're just high on affection and there's no expectations, your kids won't be life ready. And if there's just, ongoing challenge and expectations and no affection, you'll drive your kids to resentment. And they won't really want to bring their friends home. You'll be left out of the loop in their social world and they won't confide in you. You won't know what they're thinking. You can't educate them. Remember we said all moral education comes back to training and education of the mind. And you won't be able to educate them if they don't open their heart to you. They don't tell you what they're thinking. So you have to be good at showing affection. But kids will not achieve their potential if we don't ask a lot of them. One mum said, when a child's old enough to walk, he or she is old enough to vacuum. Interesting, isn't it? I've done many workshops with parents of children who are 6 and 7 years old, and the range of expectation, naturally there should be some range, but the range of expectation is remarkable. Some parents have their kids cooking cakes and hanging out washing on, standing on something and everything, right? And others practically push their kids around in a pram. So we've got to, we do the kids a favour if we ask a lot. Kids, a rule in teaching and in parenting is children rise to our expectations. But we have to put a lot of affection there. Otherwise we'll drive them away. Oh, that guy, Father Chris Riley, he's very well known in Australia because he is the biggest name in helping street kids. He's a Salesian priest. He came to Redfield one day to talk. We bring in a lot of speakers, right? And we brought in a lot of speakers. And he sent an advance party, and then he arrives in his caravan. And his caravan has his working desk, has a big dog, and it's just amazing the sort of machinery that he uses to support himself in a good sense, right? And he comes in a hurry, and we sit him down and says, look, and I tell him, look, the assembly's getting ready, just sit down. Would you like some lunch? No. Would you like a cup of tea? Okay, we'll have a cup of tea. So we get a cup of tea, and as the tea arrives, the student arrives to say that the assembly's ready. And I say, Father Chris, sit down, just have the cup of tea, because he's jumped up. And then he says, life's too busy to spend it drinking tea. Yeah, nice. I couldn't get him to have the cup of tea, right? But he said to the parents that day, have the courage to demand greatness from your kids. Now, I'm talking about really challenging your kids, right? But the issue is you can't do that if you haven't got a beautiful relationship with them. Otherwise, in the end, the line will drop out. We've done surveys with secondary children, more or less at the bottom of secondary age. You might say kids have a pretty good relationship with their parents or a not so good relationship with their parents. It's sort of a sort of condensed scale in the middle of the scale, right? And then by the time they're graduating, some kids say they have a fantastic relationship with their dad and mum, and other kids say that they have no relationship. It really polarises the older the kids get. So, that's not the kids' fault. Beautiful story. I think back to, you might have come across a book by Ray Guarendi called Back to the Family, where he interviewed the 50 best teachers in the US, and then he asked them who are the best families you've ever met, and then he interviewed the families. So it was a really beautiful way of getting the best advice into one book. There's a family that I've taught that I would put on that list, right, as the best family I've ever come across practically. And it's their Croatian background, they're Aussies, but one of the parents was born in Croatia and the other is sort of Croatian parents, and they've got, they've got a very strong family life. And the boys that I've taught, 3 of them, fantastically sort of popular boys. They've all been elected as both class captains and school captains. They're tough as nails in the sense that they win their cross country every year, each of them. They're very good soccer players and they work so hard in the classroom that they have the esteem of all of the teachers and their classmates as well. And I said, Mario, what's your secret? And he said, 2 things. First, when I was correcting my oldest boy when he was in year 7, so when he was about 12 years old, I was talking to him quietly because he never gets angry. He's a tall man and very, very softly spoken but commanding in a sense, right? And he says, I was correcting my year 7 boy, telling him I wasn't happy with something, and he had tears in his eyes. And I said I was very proud of my son because I realised what a good heart he had. But then within about a week, the behaviour that I'd corrected him on started coming back. And I said to myself, he says, this is not my son's problem, this is my problem. I have to give my son more support because he has a very good heart. He wants to do the right thing. But now I have to give him more support. So then he made the resolution. He set the goal. Remember we talked about setting goals? He set the goal of having a talk with each of his children every week. Out of that talk, he would elicit, they would agree, without him hitting them over the head, right? But they would agree on a goal for the week. And 1, I've seen the affection his children have for him, but 2, they've grown up setting themselves a weekly goal. And they're wonderful kids. The whole art form is to teach kids to run their own lives. How good is that? How wise is that? And he's done it, so it's just part of the furniture. He's been doing that with kids who've, his youngest is still only 6 or 7, right? And he's doing that with those kids. He said the other secret, now this is only for the Catholics in the audience, but he said the other secret of my home, do you believe this? This is true. He said, when we started saying the rosary every morning before school as a family. Amazing. I don't know any other family that says the rosary before school. I know a few that say it after school, and that's fantastic, right? I do have another funny rosary story. I apologise I'm putting religious stories into this. But the guy who took over from me at Wallamai, he came home and they say some prayers at night after dinner. And he said, what are we going to say these prayers for? He says to his little boy, what intention would you like to put into it? And the little guy, 6 years old, says, let's pray for the conversion of Lady Gaga. And Matt laughed like you laughed, like I laughed when I heard it. And then the little boy says to his dad, don't you believe that prayer can change Lady Gaga? And did you know that Lady Gaga's changed now? Seriously. It's amazing, eh? And I'm not saying it's that child's prayers, but pretty impressive. What about your example? Wake-up call for one parent was when his daughter was drawing pictures of the family, drawing pictures of mum and dad. Mum, big smiley face. Dad, big frowny face. That was how the daughter summed up the parents. Another parent got a massive wake-up call. His daughter said, Daddy, I know what you like. And he puffed his chest out thinking his daughter's going to tell him, she's a little tiny girl, he thinks she's going to tell him that he loves his family or something. He says, Daddy, I know what you like. You love to sit on the couch, watch television and drink beer. That was her summation of her dad. It knocked him over. And he realised, wow, I've got to change my example. And he had the humility to talk about it, which is pretty interesting, eh? Pretty nice. Chaplain at one of the schools I've taught at, who's had a lot to do with families and parents and helping families in difficulty, he said that the most important virtue for parents is humility. And Jim Stenson, who's got beautiful parenting books, says the most important thing you can teach your kids is that you want to be a better person. They see you struggling to be a better person. So we shouldn't be ashamed of saying sorry to kids. We shouldn't be ashamed of making mistakes in front of the kids. But what we do need to do is to make sure that they see us struggling to be better. We know about how imitation works. We're getting like to the very heart of this evening's talk. So the next couple of slides are very important. We know how imitation works. We've seen how powerful it is, and we know about mirror neurons and stuff like this, and how automatically we can, without even thinking about it, we can imitate a facial expression, or we can poke at, you smile at a baby, the baby smiles back, that sort of thing, right? It's automatic. The child doesn't even think about it. It's a subconscious mechanism in order to be able to learn by imitating. But we do know that mirror neurons are not just about moving muscles. Mirror neurons are about learning emotions. So they know, for example, the link between autism and a lack of mirror neurons, and how the emotional register can be compressed in a person suffering from autism. No drama. I mean, everyone's got their cross to bear, right? But the issue is that your child has an automatic mechanism to learn emotion from you. They learn joy from you. They learn sorrow from you. They learn affection. They know that the brain is more plastic in an affectionate environment. With encouragement, the brain learns more quickly. Isn't it interesting? But let's drill into this a little bit. How do your children know what you value? Where do they get their value system in life? What you value gives you happiness, I hope. So where the things you show happiness for, where you light up, when you walk in at night and you see your wife or your husband and you light up, right? When you see your kids and you light up, that teaches your kids that family is really important. So when a loved one walks into the room and you stay looking at the screen, that's also telling your child something. We've got to make sure that we really give our attention to people and we don't just stay absorbed in things. That when a phone goes off, it's not more important than the conversation with the person in front of me, in a sense, right? Or if we're expecting an important call, we apologise to the person we're talking to. This sort of thing is really important because remember, one of your key goals is to teach your kids not to be self-centred, to put other people first. So we've got to really demonstrate constantly how important other people are. Remember when St. Paul talks about love, he goes through this whole list of things, starting with patience and kindness, right? I mean, nothing's more important than that. So your emotional example is crucial. And I don't think we talk enough about emotional example. From the joy that things give you, and situations give you, and people give you, and nature gives you, your children learn what is good, true, and beautiful. And if that's one of your key tasks as a parent, to teach your kids to love what is good, true, and beautiful. And how do they know what is good, true, and beautiful? Because it gives you joy. And how do they know? Does that mean we should never show sadness? Absolutely, we should show sadness. But what we show sadness about should be big ticket items, shouldn't it? We shouldn't be sad because someone scratches the Duco on our cars. We had a car wash once. This is one of the more embarrassing moments. We had a car wash at one of the schools I was at, and one of the kids used Scotch Brite to clean the cars. That was a problem. But in the end, walking past someone asking for money, sitting on the dirt in the middle of Ottawa, that's got to cause us to be sad. Not that somebody scratched, a car or something. I mean, so what? I mean, okay, we'll ask them to pay for it, but that's, we're not going to lose our happiness over it, right? It's a very interesting problem. We have to teach kids what to find joy in and what to find sadness in. And clearly, give you another example. This is a beautiful example. We had a woman come to talk to the students at Redfield once, and she was from the States. She was on a speaking tour in Australia in a pro-life cause, and she, centre by centre, had closed down the clinics that were aborting babies in a particular state in the States, in the US. And then somebody asked her, what motivates you? And she said, a turning point in my life was either when somebody told me, or I was reading There's a verse in the gospel where she said our Lord was a cripple came up to our Lord, or a blind man came up to our Lord, and he was moved by compassion, and then he performed the miracle. So you and I have to allow our emotions to move us, our sadness to move us to do good things, but obviously we've got to get sad at the right things, and that means we have to fix our face. Our face has to be the genuine article. If your face is so important for teaching your kids emotional responses, and it's emotions that move us, then we've got to make sure that this 200 square centimetres, 9/10 of the time is very positive and cheerful, because we've got to teach our kids to stride through life. And it's not easy because, there's a lot of stress. In that survey I talked about with children and parents, when we surveyed the kids about how they communicate with their parents, time and again, children were saying that it's very difficult to communicate when mum is stressed. It's very difficult to communicate with dad when he's tired. We're showing the wrong emotions, aren't we? And we're putting... Obviously, if we're not cheerfulness is a bridge. A smile is a bridge. And if we're not cheerful, then we push people away. And how are you going to connect with your kids very well if you are not a person who's positive and cheerful? It's going to be very difficult. Maybe it's possible, but it's very difficult. What about customs of communication? John Paul II again. Do you remember, you may have read a biography about him, but by anyone's objective scale, this is like one of the great men, one of the great human beings of the last 100 years on this planet, right? And he talked about when he was 9, I think, 8 or 9, his mother died. And his father took early retirement from the army in order to raise his son, because the older brother was already left home studying medicine. So his father was always there when he came home. And every afternoon they'd go for a long walk. And this guy's was an officer in the army, and you can imagine his Polish army officer friends saying to him, "What are you doing? We're about to be invaded by Germany, and all you're doing is walking in the countryside every afternoon with your son." Well, what did he give us? He gave us a young man who was artistic, who was fantastic with people, who was an intellectual to burn, who was musical, who was dramatic. He had all these qualities all rolled into one personality. Where did he get it? From his upbringing. His dad gave him that. And we wouldn't have got John Paul II possibly if his father hadn't gone for a walk with him every afternoon. So that's what it takes, right? So how much time are you putting into your kids? Obviously, as much as you can, but can you make sure that you have a good talk every week, like Mario did with his boys and girls? Look what Mrs. Cosgrove says. Mrs. Cosgrove, she raised boys in a very humble farmhouse in central New South Wales. I knew one of the boys at uni. And she said, when one of the kids comes home, I put on the kettle, and I thought she was going to say simply, I ask him what's wrong. She says, I put on the kettle, I tell him a good story, and then he's loose enough to tell her what's wrong. So you've got to be really wise to get your kids to loosen up and talk to you, don't you? There's an art form in it. And mums are very good at it. In the survey, mums trumped the dads in terms of being able to communicate with their kids. The boys said that they communicated much better with mum than dad on average. And I don't have the data for girls, I apologise. But the secret weapon that mums had was food. They said, the students time and time again said the best time, because one of the questions, when the best time to talk with mum? When's the best time to talk with dad? And time and again the kids said when there's afternoon tea on the table when they get home. Great, eh? Use the secret weapon. What about right and wrong? Again, I love these ancient quotes because it shows you that what we're talking about is timeless wisdom. It's not somebody's opinion. The ancient Greeks believed that when a person knows the difference between right and wrong, they're ready for adulthood. That was Homer. And the Greeks looked at Homer like the Bible, right? That was their belief. You have to give your kids the guidebook of what's right and wrong. Remember we said that the emotional virtues, if you like, are temperance and fortitude, and the virtues for thinking clearly are the virtue where we take others into account, and we know what's right and wrong, and we set goals. So you've got to make sure that you talk clearly to your kids about what's right and wrong. If they're forearmed, they're much less likely to fall into traps. They did a survey in the UK in 2012, a cross-parliamentary survey, where they interviewed thousands and thousands of young kids, 16-year-olds, and they discovered that 4 out of 5 16-year-olds access pornography regularly. 4 out of 5. What's that mean? I mean, what's that going to do to the next generation of parents? And the numbers are getting worse, right? Those numbers are worse than several years before. And I saw a number earlier this year that was 9 out of 10 accessing pornography regularly. So, would any of those kids not be accessing pornography if their parents had diligently warned them about how much it was going to drive them into themselves and how it was going to be damaging for their future relationships and marriages? We know how much pornography damages marriages. I don't think many of the parents would have had that conversation with their kids in any depth. So, we have a duty to make sure kids know the difference between right and wrong. And there's far more, it's not just a matter of sexual mores, right? There's a lot of other things as well. Putting people first. A guy I know, he said when he came from mainland China. When he moved out of home, when he was 17 to go to university, he wasn't Christian. He was no religion apart from the sort of traditional beliefs and communist indoctrination. And he said, my father wrote me a letter when I was 17. And he said, and he quoted the letter to me. He said, my son, do not do drugs, do not gamble, do not play around with sex because you will need to be faithful to the woman you marry. Whoa. Not bad advice, eh? And 30 years later, he remembered the advice perfectly. When you talk to kids and you give them instruction, don't think that it's just water washing over a rock. Kids remember it if you get them at the right moment. I remember when I was in the very early years of one of the schools I was at, I was teaching primary class, and I made up silly stories about Rufus and Brutus. Rufus is the guy who always gets it right, and Brutus always makes mistakes and learns from his mistakes, right? And I made up the stories on the spot. I would have forgotten them the next day. 8 years later, one of the guys in that class came up to me, told the story word for word, and then he said, what happened next? When you get kids at the right moment, every word is going in. You're forming their mind, you're educating their mind. So we have to take conversation with children very seriously. Look at that quote from Plutarch. For intelligent people, the passage from childhood to adulthood is not an abandonment of rules, but a change of ruler. So you're raising your kids to be their own ruler, to set their own goals. So if you overmanage your kids, you're always, if you're a monopolistic sort of parent who you're just constantly just telling your kids what to do, you're not doing them a favour. I was racing off one time, and I was going to give a talk later in the day to some parents, and I asked the guy who was the general secretary of the schools that I was involved in, of the parent company, quick, John, I'm going to talk to some parents, quick. He's got 9 kids. Give me something to say. And he stopped for about 2 seconds, and then he said, tell them the more they love their kids, the less they do for them. Isn't that interesting? Now, obviously not being heartless, but we're raising kids to stand on their own feet. And we're doing it with a lot of affection. And we do them a big favour. You'd think that in terms of teaching right and wrong, that the net is a big issue, right? We shouldn't be fearful of the net. We should have a management plan. We should make sure we get the best out of it, like the best out of television, and ignore the rest, right? But when Pope Benedict was asked about what's the best thing for parents to do to manage the net and to manage technology, he wrote about this. He said, I thought, he didn't say get a really strong filter on the home computer. Obviously, you've got to filter what's coming in so that the kids don't get into a situation they can't handle. You have to filter the home computer. And you don't put a smartphone in the hands of a 13-year-old if you have not formed the conscience of the 13-year-old. See what he says? He says, parents have the right and duty to ensure the prudent use of media by training the conscience of their kids. That's your job. Nobody else is responsible for that. Look at the guy on the right. He's one of Australia's youngest Catholic priests. This is not a story about priests, by the way. This is a story about how to talk to your kids. He came and spoke at the school. By the way, it's a beautiful story, but he came and spoke at the school, and one of the boys in the class asked him, "Why did you want to become a priest, Daniel?" He went to Redfield and then he came back afterwards as a seminarian. And then he said, "When I was 7, my father said to me, 'Daniel, why don't you pray every day to discover what God wants of you in life?'" He didn't say pray to be a priest. He just said, he gave him some advice to pray that he finds out what his path is in life. And I would see Daniel in the chapel at school. It was a Catholic chapel. And I thought to myself at times, Dan, go out and play, but he knew better. And then he said, when I was 12, I had just been to Mass, I'd been to receive Holy Communion, I was doing my Thanksgiving, and I felt this overwhelming sense of peace that I was meant to be a priest. And I've never doubted it since. And the boys in the class were pretty impressed. This is not about being a priest. This is about the wisdom of taking conversation with a 7-year-old seriously. The father knew that what he was saying was going in, and he was forming that child for life, and it paid off handsomely. A couple of years later, after he was ordained, he's a seminarian in that picture, he came back and he told the same story from the lectern in the chapel. And then he said, when I was sitting just in that seat there when I was 12, and the kid who was sitting in that seat in the chapel sort of ducked, But when he was a deacon, he studied his last year or two in Rome. When he was a deacon, at the induction, the inauguration mass of Pope Francis, in front of 1 billion people, he sang the responsorial psalm, and he brought Pope Francis's ring on a cushion, right? I mean, all because his father had the wisdom to talk to a 7-year-old kid and take conversation with a 7-year-old kid seriously. We sell kids short. I've seen how much I've seen schools that baby kids when they're 7 and 8 and 9 and they just do colouring in and they hardly teach them to spell. And I've seen other schools where the kids already know all 45 sounds of English and they can put those sounds together when they're already just 7 years old. We don't want to baby kids. I put that in not so much because of, obviously sacraments are big. If you're a Catholic family, please tell your kids we draw our strength from the sacraments. Otherwise they won't get the difference, right? But I put this in because these 3 boys are standing in front of the Martyrs Memorial in Nagasaki. We had a long-term exchange with Nagasaki. And when you want to pass on ideals and faith to your kids, give them experiences. Don't just tell them. Give them experiences. There's so much wisdom in taking children to mow the lawn next door. Or, a friend of mine, he wanted to impress upon his sons and daughters that they can't let themselves go when they're young adults. He's a quantity surveyor. So he went into the street where there's a lot of sort of, misbehaviour, if you like. But the next morning, so there was broken glass, there was vomit, there was everything, right? And then he goes to McDonald's and he talks to his sons and daughters. He took them in under an excuse that he just wanted to do some work in the city, but he knew what he wanted really. He wanted to expose them to an experience that he could talk to them about. Your convictions have to bring you happiness. Otherwise your daughter's going to say to you, "Mum, I love you, but I need values that are going to bring me happiness. Your values don't seem to make you happy. You're just stressed all the time." So inputs, we've talked about that. But let's realise that you have to get enough weight on the end of the seesaw. What about mistakes? Correct your kids. When there's a pattern developing, we need to correct children. If there's a pattern developing and we don't correct them, it turns into a habit. And if it's a pattern of talking about other people badly, or criticising other kids, or a pattern of lying, a child who's 7 or 8, they're reaching the point where they should never be lying. And if your child is still lying when they're 8 or 9, they know what they're doing. They know they're doing the wrong thing. And you've got to think, are they doing it because they're scared of me? Maybe I've got to temper my parenting. Maybe they're doing this because they're just fearful, and fear paralyses. But maybe they're getting into a habit where they're lying. And there comes a point when you do things enough that you become a liar. You change yourself as a person, and it becomes a lot harder then to change. Nice story. Very quickly, one of the kids was shoplifting. The owner of the shop rings us and says, "Hey, I got one of your boys here." We talk to him, say, "You've got to go home, talk to Dad about this." He goes home, but we ring his dad because we know his dad's pretty fiery. And we said, "Your son's got to talk to you tonight about something that's really important. Please hear him out." The next day, Dad rang us and said, "Thank you. My son grew 6 inches last night. We've had the best conversation we've ever had." Wow. But when that boy left school 9 years later, I asked him to write with his classmates, "What's the best moment you've ever had in school?" And he wrote about that conversation with his dad. We've got this very deep understanding that we have to be sincere. If you raise your children to be sincere and generous, wow, they're on the money. Remember the truth and love thing? If they're sincere and generous, they can be seeking the truth in life and they can love wisely. It's very difficult to find a picture of a cat smiling. Raphael Pick is the father of 16. We've had him out to Australia a couple of times. He's passed away now, but he said, "Look, you've got to get your family life right. What manages the emotional tone of your home? What controls the emotional tone in your home? This 200 square centimetres. Remember your face? You've got to fix your face. Your face manages the home." Silly story. A friend of mine is a very, very passionate Middle Eastern gentleman. And he tells this story with all humility. He says, "I was getting really angry at my daughter and I didn't want to get angry. So I went into the laundry and I fixed my face." Right? I fixed my face and I walked out, and as soon as I walked through the door, my daughter she screamed, "Daddy's got the face." He thought he'd fixed his face. We don't know ourselves very well, do we, sometimes? We think we're coming across and your spouse reads you like a book, right? We think we're keeping it in. We can think we're being very positive with the kids, and we've actually just got we've got our face on. Correct your kids calmly, because you have to model self-control. And if you are the sort of person that loses your temper sometimes, it's probably good advice never to lose it, particularly with your kids. That's strong, I know, it's very difficult. And kids are forgiving, but if a pattern develops where you just react always by getting cranky, it's not going to solve the problem. These next 4 slides are quite important. Look at the quote from Aristotle. He talks about how virtues make all the difference. These are some very practical ideas about building the 4 virtues. So think of yourself, don't think of your kids. When you're called for dinner, do you come? Do you know how to stop a phone call when you're at the dinner table? Knowing when to stop, telling ourselves when to stop, helps us teach the kids when to stop, right? What do we pay? This is another important thing. They know a lot about how attention is directed in the brain, right? What areas of the brain are sort of responsible for attention. There's a big connection between what we pay attention to and what we like, what we're interested in, what we love. The things we pay attention to, we love. You go into at knock-off time in a school at sort of 3 o'clock, you can see all the kids preening themselves, in front of mirrors, right? It's natural, but somehow once we get older, we know that we've got to give our attention to people more than to ourselves, right? So what do we pay attention to? Do we pay attention excessively to our financial situation? Do we pay attention excessively to the state of the nation? Or do we stay positive in the face of difficulties, I've talked most of those other things, but people come first, not things. Fortitude. Practically speaking, what about your jobs list for the kids? Do you change your jobs list every year so that you ask a little bit more every year? Can you say honestly that you're modelling optimism for your kids, or do they see you stressed? Do you model a life of faith if you're a person with religious faith? Justice is all about kindness in every situation, compassion. And sometimes kindness, of course, is talking to people directly and saying, that's not good enough. That's okay, but do it with courtesy. Your kids have to have this skill about paying attention to people, being grateful. I've given a number of lectures recently to adults, and I realised although the evaluation feedback was very, very good, one or two would come up and say thanks at the end of it. So I deliberately put into one of the lectures how important it is to say thanks. And then like 10 or 12 people came up and said thanks at the end. This is not about getting thanks. This is about how somehow you can train people to be grateful if you encourage them to be grateful. And with little kids, they can develop the habit. And we've covered most of these points, but besides setting priorities and goals, we need time to reflect. If we're getting around with earbuds all the time in our ears, it's not a good recipe for having peace of mind, being able to stop and think about things. How do you teach your kids that? We talked about sincerity, how important that is. We've talked about human love and relationships. And there's nothing, there's very few things that are more important than your conversations to guide the development of your kids in this. There's a beautiful resource, if you found it online, if you're interested, called As I Have Loved You, and it's by a guy called Jared O'Shea in Australia. But it's basically a workbook that has enough content for parents, and it's broken up in this way, to have weekly or fortnightly conversations with their kids from early puberty right through to late puberty. I mean, it's an amazing resource. As I Have Loved You. But out of this can come not only the privilege of imparting to your kids this most beautiful truth, but also a very close relationship. One dad was telling me that he was trying to talk to his boy. His wife was expecting, and he thought, here's an opportunity. So he says to his 10-year-old boy, I want to talk to you, Chris, about where babies come from. And Chris says straight away, it's okay, Dad, I know all about it. And Dad worked up a lot of courage to say that. So he's a bit deflated, right? But then he thinks quick, and he says to his son, tell me about it. And then the boy goes all wobbly-kneed. And he says, oh, Dad, run it past me again. And they have a fantastic conversation. Right? Final reflections. Mount Maunganui is in a beautiful headland with a beach stretched out under it and a township in New Zealand. And I was there once, and I walked to the top of this sort of 1,000-foot headland. And I was sitting on a rock, and this guy appears behind me with his 14-year-old boy, and he says, excuse me, you're sitting on my prayer rock. So I jumped up. But he was sort of joking. But he said, I'm the Baptist minister for the township you can see down there. And there's a lot of hurt down there amongst my congregation. And I come up here 3 days a week to sit on that rock in the morning before I start work and to pray for them. It's a good thing that our God has big ears. But isn't that beautiful? When you have a responsibility for people, you've got a duty to pray for those people if you've got faith, right? And, I have been an employer. I employ people. If I don't give those people what they need to do their job, I'm not a good employer. If you're coming from a religious faith point of view, you know that God's given you this job to raise your kids and to do a really good job raising your kids. So he's going to give you all you need to do the job. He's better than the best employer. But ask him for the help. I remember asking my granny when I was at uni a long time ago, Granny, pray for me, I've got an exam tomorrow. And she said, I've prayed for you every day of your life. Of course I'll pray for you tomorrow. It's interesting, isn't it? Your kids need to know that. So walk out with one or two goals. One student that I had once, he put 99 on his wall in front of his desk 2 years before he graduated. And his father walked in and said, Patrick, I don't want you to be disappointed, mate. And he said, Dad, I need a goal. His dad thought he would get about 80. He got 98.7. And he worked his tail off. Your kids have to set their goals. Don't tell them what goals they've got to have, but nurture it, right? And the ultimate goal, of course, is that your kids learn to love. And for that, we have to learn to love. better and better. That quote comes from John Paul II in his first encyclical, but it's very much psychology. It's not even theology in a sense, right? We have to discover love. So parenting essentially is a knocking at the door of your soul to be a better person. And if we want to really get it right in terms of raising our kids so that they're very strong and they can control their impulses, they can put others first, they can think clearly, we've got to be the best person we can be. And it'll pay off. It's worth it, right? Gillian, thank you very much.